Perfect. This is better.
So we are live. Hello friends, I'm Haimanti, project lead for the Story Project 10 by www.tellmeastory.biz. Welcome you to the inaugural episode of the Devi series. I'm privileged to have with us Dr. Namrata Poddar this evening, and we are going to discuss Parivartan, the transformation, women's evolution in contemporary narratives. Chinnamasta is a figure of radical transformation, a great yogini. She conveys the universal message that all life is sustained by other forms of life, and destruction and sacrifice are necessary for continuity of creation. The goddess symbolizes pralay, that is cosmic dissolution, where she swallows all creation and makes way for new creation, thus conveying the idea of transformation. Transformation in the contemporary world is going beyond the way you live, co creating a better life for yourself, the way you live through your thoughts, visualization, words, faith, action, or a combination of them as a result of experiences you gather in day to day life. This we shall discuss this evening with special reference to Dr. Namrata Poddar's book, Borderless. Tell Me Your Story calls for submission on the story prompt Devi. Registrations are also open for Writing Program Season 7. Let me begin with introducing the author this evening. Dr. Namrata Poddar writes fiction and non-fiction, serves as interviews editor for Quelly, and teaches literature and writing at UCLA. Her work has appeared in several publications, including Poets and Writers, Literary Hub, Long Reads, the Kenyan Review, and the Best Asian Short Stories. Her debut Borderless was a finalist for Feminist Press Louis Meriwether Prize and is longlisted for the Center of Fiction First Nobel Prize. She holds a PhD in French literature from the University of Pennsylvania and MFA in fiction from Bennington College and a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in transnational cultures from UCLA. Welcome, ma'am. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Haimanti, and please call me Namrata. I insist.
All right. Namrata, so I would like you to introduce your book, Borderless, which has been released recently. And can you please introduce your book with the women characters and their relevance to the story to our audience?
Sure. So, hi everyone. This is my debut novel. I hope you can see it. It's called Borderless. And speaking of Project Devi, also, I'm totally giving away a spoiler here, but here on the book cover, you have the image of a woman holding a damru, and she embodies Devi or Shakti, who plays a really important role in the book. So Borderless, it's a novel, it's a fragmented novel, it's an experimental novel trying consciously to challenge some of the assumptions of what we understand to be a good story. It's divided into two sections, roots and routes. The roots part takes place in India, in Mumbai, the city that raised me in many ways. And the second half takes place in Southern California for most of it, with layovers. I mean, we have characters in the book from all across the world. So the book is, they travel all across, and that's why the story travels in different parts as well. So Mumbai and Greater Los Angeles would be the two main locations, but the book and the characters in it travels to the islands in the Indian Ocean, to the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, India as well, and other places. I've always found a book like this one to be hard to summarize, but taking into consideration some of the sort of, mainstream assumptions of storytelling, I would say the main character of the novel is a call center agent in Mumbai. Her name is Dia Mittal, and the book begins with her working at a call center as a call center agent for Hansa Airlines, where she's sort of serving Americans. And at some point, she migrates to America via other parts of the world that I don't want to talk about. And so that's the main character. And her story throughout the novel is woven with stories of different characters, different Indian or South Asian characters from all across the world, who all these characters are border crossing. They're migrants in one way or the other, not just away from India. They have not just migrated away from India, but there are migrants in India as well. For instance, the story of Diya Mittal is juxtaposed at some point with the story of a Nepali maid in Mumbai. So Nepali maid is also a migrant. These stories are then juxtaposed with stories of blue-collared workers in the hospitality or the hotel industry, and they are having a conversation at some point in Mumbai slums. And they are migrants as well, the gardeners, the janitors working at this luxury hotel, the Raj Mahal, which is sort of a wink to the Taj Mahal Hotel in Mumbai. So I think that's what is this book then? If it is weaving the story of Diya Mittal, who's a call center agent who migrates to the US, with all these other characters from different parts of the world who share a South Asian origin. I would say it's a portrait, it's a self-portrait, but it's not a self-portrait of me as an author, it's a self-portrait of our South Asian community, South Asia and her diaspora, predominantly through India, not exclusively through India, but predominantly through India. So it's sort of a community self-portrait of Desis from across the world. And what do we look like in 21st century literature? What do we sound like in 21st century literature? So that's sort of a main gist. And coming back then also, Haimanti, to what you were talking about, the theme of Devi. So the cover features, I see Devi to be synonymous with Shakti. That also stands for the divine feminine in Hindu mythology. And Shakti is an important motif throughout the book, actually Shakti as the divine feminine, but also Shiva and Shakti as the divine androgyne, the Ardhanarishwari. That's a motif throughout the book. The book, okay, I'm going to give it away in this talk, ends with the voice of Shakti speaking, and sort of her perspective and what she has to say plays a very important role in the novel. It in many ways explains the title, it explains the cover. At the same time, it makes a commentary on what is the novel today as a form of storytelling. And it makes a case for the transformation of the modern novel as a form. So you were talking about, how Devi and the form that you were, the particular avatar or the roop that you were talking about, and how she was a yogini, and she stands also for destruction, right? As being sort of a precondition for creation. And the book too ends on Tandava, the great dance, one can say, of destruction and creation. Of course, it is my reimagination of the Tandava dance. It's not trying to stay close to certain authoritative sources of Hindu mythology, but as a fiction writer, I've tried to reimagine it. And the book ends on that note as well, yours in the dance of destruction and creation. And it's kind of alluding what needs to be destroyed so that writers like us in the world today can create new forms of storytelling within a scene that can often be seen to be so dominated by the Western perspective on what good storytelling is, and even Anglophone literature, right? So much of it is dominated by British or American writers. So it's kind of commenting on that. It's kind of playing with those ideas as well. So that was a very
Wow.
long answer.
That that sounds really interesting. And when you were talking about transformation or change, we can say that change or transformation is inevitable. How do you see Borderless and its layered narrative and characters' interaction with transformation of hope or hope of transformation, if you can, be it on a geographical, social, or psychological level?
Yeah, so I think transformation is such an important word in so many ways that defines what literature is, what a good story is, right? In our very kind of conventional understanding of good storytelling, what happens is we have a character's journey. And at some point toward the end, right, this idea of resolution, a character changes or transforms, and that's when the story ends. So, in many ways, one can say that transformation is the precondition to any stories. And the way this book is built or structured, like I said, it's the story of one character having a dialogue with the story of other South Asian characters from across the world. So I would also say, in perhaps narrow terms, if we had to label sort of what the form of the book is, that in some ways this book is also a novel in stories because it's telling the stories of multiple characters. And all of these characters, as in any good story, undergo transformation. But half of the characters, you would say, it's also so many of them are leading cyclical lives, like they cannot escape their situation. So transformation in that sense is really sort of a psychological shift in perspective that, whoa, I have to live with this. Change may not happen. The hope of transformation. And at the same time, I wouldn't say that there is no hope, that these characters are hopeless. Many of them are stuck. I think transformation happens through some small gesture of agency, like, they have some power to kind of uh, come to terms with their situation, which will not change. So I think transformation happens in an obvious way in the book, in the sense you can see certain characters and how they change. The main character, Dia, certainly changes. But there are characters who are stuck, and then when they realize, oh, I may never be able to experience the transformation that I dream of, how do they then express their agency within that? And those happen through smaller gestures of rebellion or resilience.
Wow. So I think that is something which we can take back home from this novel, and I'm really interested to read this. Um, so my next question is that the brown border crossing characters of Borderless speak the subaltern voice of a brown and a woman juggling in the intersection of class, race, gender, nationality. How was your journey towards the identification or creation of this complex and layered characters?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. What you're talking about really is intersectional identity, right? Most of the characters are more than one thing, so to speak. They're brown, they're women, some of them are poor, some of them are affluent, upper class, some of them are straight. There is a character who's not heterosexual, who is queer. So, I mean, most of these characters, even if almost all of them are border crossing, they cross borders in some ways, and that's what unites these characters. They embody other identity markers. And how did I go about it? To be honest, this is the reading I see about my characters as you do when I wear the critic's hat. When I look at my stories after they're done, and I can see, oh, these characters, embody all these different identity markers within them. But when I'm writing, as a writer, as a fiction writer. I'm not thinking I'm going to create um, necessarily like a brown woman character, even if that's the character that comes to my mind. I'm not as compelled. So far, every character that came to my mind was brown, which is natural because they are part of my world, it's part of my community. I would be very surprised, and I'm open to being surprised in my creative process if I suddenly had like a white man from Kansas City come to be as a character. It could, but it's I'm willing to be surprised, but that doesn't happen. So Dia's voice, Dia, the main character, most of my characters have always come to me. I think all of them have come through me through voices in my head. And this is the process, right? Certain characters, for certain writers, they say, including Toni Morrison, I remember she said that I begin with an image in my head.
Yeah.
I almost always begin with a voice. I'm very voice driven writer. I'm a very voice driven reader. When I read as well, first thing I notice is what's the voice like. So all these characters came to me as voices, and my job as fiction writer was to just sort of follow these voices and see where they take me. And that's what I did. And at some point in the advanced stages of writing, there were many voices, and I knew that these are one too many. I cannot fit so many. So then certain voices I had to keep maybe for future writing and include in the book only those that felt more urgent, but also relevant to the structure of the novel. And then, of course, they came as brown. I was surprised because when I write nonfiction, my work is known to critique, talk about decolonization, and I engage a lot with white Western cultural hegemony. So there's a lot of dialogue against whiteness, so to speak. But I was surprised that in this world of fiction, the characters that came were almost all brown. That just white characters did not come to me. There are very few white characters in the book, even if they are there in secondary ways and they play an important role. But the predominant world of this world is brown. And yeah, I mean, the whole range of class also came to me because I grew up in Mumbai. I think if it's an extremely class conscious city, and if you've grown up in the city, you'll know that sort of the rich and the poor, some of the poorest in the world and some of the richest in the country, they live side by side. It's impossible to escape those class contrasts. So that was sort of part of my world growing up as well, but also just within the community. I mean, this is a larger sort of personal story, but growing up, I could totally navigate the range of classes as well from where I come from. So those things come up. Long story short, it wasn't done intentionally. It was just following the characters, and then they each revealed to be the intersection of certain qualities that we're looking at, if this makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So, when we are talking about people, those they are crossing borders, alienation and displacement are also the aspects of migration. So, yes, being a post-colonial transnational novel, the displacement is present on so many levels. So, to what extent do you feel that the novel explores the whole process of displacement and then alienation?
So maybe starting with the last part of your question. Alienation, I see it to be the effect of displacement. When anyone experiences displacement, alienation is a normal feeling in many ways to experience. And place, literally like place, what place? Mumbai, Bombay, Los Angeles, what place? And displacement has been a connecting motif of almost all of my work of 20 years now. And I mean teaching, research, nonfiction that I wrote for many years before publishing this debut novel this year, all of it. So as in most of my work, even in Borderless, as the title also says, place and displacement are very important aspects or structuring devices. And because almost all of the characters are border crossing, they've crossed borders from where they are to some other place where they now are, they experience alienation in many ways. But I feel like alienation is not just experienced because of border crossing in the book. Alienation is experienced at the level of class as well. When hanging out certain characters who've had access to less resources in life hang out with characters who live very privileged lives. There is alienation experience. The alienation is experienced with characters at the level of sexual orientation. So, for instance, there is a chapter in the book that tells the story of a retired motel owner in California who has a queer daughter, who has a lesbian daughter, but she will not tell her family or the community about her sexual orientation and how she experiences alienation in her own family. And then it sort of, develops that relationship of father and daughter, that as well. So alienation is experienced at multiple levels, like I said, not just in terms of place and displacement with geography, but place and displacement with sexual orientation, class, etc. Does the novel portray the whole range of experiences with displacement or alienation? No, I don't think any novel can. That's a highly ambitious project. I don't think we are even in a place, right, as human beings or authors, to name that whole experience. So no, what it does is it gives a glimpse, or maybe hopefully a little more than a glimpse, into that experience of displacement and alienation.
Okay, so the narrative of Borderless, as you were talking already, is a tapestry that pulls out threads from the past and present, from Mumbai to California, crossing and blending stories. How much do you connect yourself or your experiences to the characters or the narrator?
I completely connect myself to the world that I build into this novel because I'm the author. So, like most authors, I connect with the world. Why would I want to write or create a world and give it 17 years of my life, which is almost half my life, if I did not connect with that world? I do completely connect with every character created in this book, and almost every character there. I hope there are no angels and devils, in two separate teams. I think so many characters are both angels and devils, and I connect to that experience as well because I think we as human beings are a bunch of contradiction. But like we said, the main thrust, maybe the unifying thread in the lives of all these characters is border crossing and migration within South Asia, or from South Asia to Africa, for instance, or Caribbean, or the United Kingdom, or the USA in very obvious ways. And migration, 20 years of my work, again, has focused on this idea of migration in teaching, in research, in nonfiction and fiction. And it is an experience that deeply defines who I am, not just as someone who migrated from India to America, but as someone who comes from a community of migrants, because I'm a Marwari writer, and Marwaris from Rajasthan, or at least my ancestors and forefathers, they did not stay rooted in Rajasthan. Most of them moved, and especially from the Shekhawati region where we are. We are traders by history. So we moved to different parts of India, urban India. So I come from a community of migrants, a history of migration, and then I migrated further away to USA. So that has always been sort of a very key defining experience of my life. And it is a defining experience of the characters within Borderless as well, including the Marwari merchants that come up in one part of the novel in Rajasthan, right? And we are transported back to the Silk Road days and the history of trading during the Silk Road.
How do you see the power play? Because you were already talking about people from different genders, from different class intersecting in your book. So I would like to ask you that how do you see the power play within genders and class in your book?
Ooh, that's a big question. The book is about, in addition to border crossing, which unites the whole book, I would say every chapter is united by power plays or the dynamic, a certain dynamic of power play. So, in addition to migration, power has always interested me as a theme. I talk about decolonization a lot in my nonfiction work, like 20 years again of my work has focused on that. And I'm very interested, have always been for 20 years now, interested in exploring the question of power as it takes different forms. So when I talk about decolonization, it is how those who were formerly, and decolonization is also a big theme in this novel. The novel, in many ways, is trying to decolonize what our mainstream understanding can be of the novel in Anglophone literature. So power plays come up in terms of sort of, a writer at the level of the author. It comes as an author from a formerly colonized world, and how her creation in this book is sort of resisting, right? A colonial understanding of the novel. So that's sort of one kind of a power play at the level of creation of the book that it's engaging with. But power play at the level of gender comes up in smaller ways as well. These are some of the bigger historic questions, but in smaller ways, they come up constantly. And I think one of the places where this power play is most obvious, even if I think it's everywhere in the book, is in the second half of the book when Dia gets married. And suddenly, from a very independent woman, who, after being a call center agent, who makes enough money and who kind of migrates abroad to study, and then she becomes a corporate consultant and travels across the world. Then at some point, she gets married and has a child. And then suddenly, she's not as independent anymore. She is, sort of life. She's forced in some ways by circumstances or motherhood to be in the role of a caregiver. And then you have the dynamic, right, with her larger family, with partner in marriage, but also family in law. So those are sort of the moments when the power play with gender dynamic comes in. What happens when sort of an outspoken, independent woman is expected to abide maybe by the elders in the community to kind of more traditional domestic roles. So those are at the daily level, those power plays. How do women negotiate that? Then there is another instance of power play at the level of gender, but also race and place. Is Dia's best friend in the book, Noor, who is from an African island, Mauritius. So she is in a room with her Indian American family. She marries an Indian American and is in a room full of Indian Americans. And suddenly she experiences the racism from her new brown American family in the same way as she would experience racism from white people across the world. So those power plays that happen then, and then that is even compounded by sexism or misogyny in the scene. And I know these must sound abstract because one has to read the book or to be able to sort of tease out those specific moments in the story. So power play happens, like at so many levels, like I said, at the level of domesticity, in heterosexual marriages, when feminist women or, opinionated women are confronted with patriarchy in marriage, that as well, but also with different kinds of South Asians in a room. When there's a South Asian from India in a room, when there's a South Asian from Africa in the room, when there's a South Asian from America in the room, who holds maximum power and who exerts that power on the other. Those are the kinds of power plays that are teased out in the book. And certainly the book ends on a strong note of power play as well, when Shakti, or Devi, decides to speak. And she's talking to some of the key figures in a fictionalized way of South Asian history and mythology, but also she's talking very directly to the Western literary establishment and kind of commenting on what a story is.
That's amazing. And also, another very interesting fact is that this mode of storytelling seems to draw on the oral traditions, emphasizing repetition, rhythm, reinvention. Please tell us about your inspiration for choosing this style of narration.
So, oral storytelling, thank you for noticing that. Oral storytelling is super important to me. We are in this room as creatives of Indian origin, South Asian origin, oral storytelling. We have a rich legacy in our culture of oral storytelling, the Jatka tales, the Panchatantra, really, I mean, the Mahabharata as well. I mean, it was a compilation, right, of stories passed down in time until it became sort of a book at some point in history. As I mean, as a writer of South Asian origin, this is such an important part. It's a part not just of my heritage, but it's a part of my everyday life. If we think about Bollywood as well, and what Mumbaikar can ignore the presence of Bollywood in their life, right? But I feel that about Indians in general and Indians across the world. We are united in many ways by our relationship to Bollywood, whatever that relationship is. It draws so heavily. I mean, if you look at songs and lyrics, it draws so heavily from oral traditions as well. And then a few years back, I wrote an essay which was received very well by the literary world in Literary Hub. It's an online, well-known literary magazine, and it was called "Is Show Don't Tell a Universal Truth or a Colonial Relic?" Meaning, especially in American writing workshops, creative writing workshops, and it's a model of teaching a story that is becoming a colonizer of its own and kind of exporting, right, to other parts of the world. There is this idea that in a good story, you show, don't tell. Okay. And in my essay, I challenged that idea that a good storytelling is not just about the visual, of experiencing the visual through the lives of the characters, but it is as much about telling. A good story also tells as much. Or sometimes a good story, and there are parts of the world where we have rich legacies, including India, South Asia, and Africa, where the stories do the more telling than showing. And that idea that, a good story is not something that just favors the experience of visual, that what we can see as readers. A good story is something where we can hear as well the voices. So those were sort of orality. I call it orality. It's not just the visual, but orality that dominates. And it's very important to me, as I shared with you earlier in this conversation, that personally, I am not an image-driven writer, as many writers are or have proclaimed or claimed to be. I'm definitely a voice-driven writer and a voice-driven reader. It's very important for me to know what these characters talk like, what do they sound like. So in that sense, orality comes into the book. You will see almost every character speaks a different English. When we have, say, for instance, a gardener at the Raj Mahal luxury hotel, Raj Mahal, talking in Mumbai slums, he speaks English in a certain way. When you have an Indo-Mauritian who was raised in Mauritius and Madagascar, and then who has worked in France, and then who comes to the United States, that character speaks English in a different way. Dia speaks English in a very different way when she's a call center agent who is talking to her American clients. And she speaks English in a very different way when she is with her girlfriends in the US. And she speaks English in a different way when maybe she is fighting with a mother in Mumbai, something like that. So all the characters, depending on the situations, they use language in different ways. And that's where orality comes in. But oral traditions also, because it's part of our legacy. So framing device, if you think about the 1001 Nights, if you think about the Panchatantra, if you think about the Jatka tales, framing device is so important. We begin with some kind of a frame, and then we enter the story. And same with Rajasthani art, Rajasthani dance as well. I feel, when I think like framing is so important to the artwork. If you think about those miniature paintings of Rajasthan, you'll always see there's a frame, and then there's the story or the painting inside it. So those frame devices were very important to me. And the novel uses frame devices, but not exactly in those traditional ways as some of the older art have, but it kind of plays with them and uses these frame devices in different ways. So that's where it draws from those oral traditions. At the same time, even if it's part of our legacy, we also live in 21st century. I grew up in Bombay. I live in Greater Los Angeles. One is the home of Bollywood. Another is the home of Hollywood. And these are homes of some of the largest legacies of visual storytelling because of the film industry, right? And we live in a digital age with Instagram or TikTok. We live in an age of visual storytelling. So I think it draws from both. It draws from all these traditions, oral storytelling traditions of my Rajasthani ancestors or South Asian heritage at large, but also visual storytelling from, say, Hollywood or Bollywood and digital culture, less maybe digital culture, a little more social media. And when I say it draws from Hollywood and Bollywood, I mean this idea of writing in scenes. There are parts of the book that have been written in scenes or kind of stay close to this idea of showing, not telling. And there are other parts which are telling, but I'd like to say it does both. Borderless is kind of a combination in terms of its aesthetic of both the visual and the oral, or the showing and the telling, which I think most well-written stories are anyway.
That's very interesting. And another very intriguing thing is the psychological pursuit of an American dream, which brings forth the transformation not only on a geospatial level, but also on psychological grounds in the process of transforming their habits, way of living, choice of profession, and even the search of home within. So, how was your creative process of designing this narrative? How did you go about it?
Yeah, I think my answer to that is the same as before. Once again, I agree that the characters, many, not all, there are migrants in the book that are living in India. So they are not, how would I say, they are not driven by the American dream. It is characters like Dia, the call center agent, who is driven by the American dream. And American dream is what? This fantasy, right? It's this fantasy that if you come to America and you work hard enough, you succeed. The idea of equal opportunity to all, which is a fantasy. And, of course, so there are characters who are lured by this fantasy and who migrate. And the moment migration happens, whether it is of a Nepali maid from a village close to Kathmandu who comes to Mumbai, or it is of Dia from Mumbai, eventually to Greater Los Angeles, even if she travels a lot in between to other parts of the world. The moment migration comes into the picture as an experience, as a life experience, transformation is bound to happen in big ways. So they do happen psychologically, the way the characters change, the way they talk, the food they eat, that as well. But transformation also happens in the life journeys of characters like Dia, who's a lower middle class character in the first chapter when she serves American clients, really desperate, right, to make money because she's the sole provider of her family. Her dad is diagnosed with cancer, and she's the sole breadwinner for her family. So it shows her in really desperate sort of a financial situation. In the second half of the book, when she's migrated to America, and she has already worked a good deal and traveled across the world. At that time, upward mobility in class happens. And those bring different habits. Suddenly she doesn't speak in the same way as she was speaking before. And, she eats different kinds of food. So those of course, constant transformation takes place, including, like I said, that character, a retired motel owner in California who runs a motel when he comes to US. And it really shows the struggle of this character who comes from rural India to the US, and how sort of he learns to survive and create a life of his own in the US. All of these change dramatically over time. And what do they eat? What do they talk like? What is their daily lives like? Honestly, what was it like, the creative process? The creative process was a much simpler one. These are the kinds of analyses we can do when we read the book. And when we kind of analyze the book or wear an analytical lens. In the creative journey, in the creative process of the book, it was really following the character one step at a time. This is okay, the character is in rural India. What next? Okay, the character doesn't have money to feed his family. What next? Oh, okay, he met some friends who have just returned from the US, and we're talking, hey, you can have a slightly better life here. That, and next, and next, and next. So that was sort of the journey. And the journey did take 17 years for a reason. It's my first book. I didn't know, I never imagined myself to be a novelist. I wanted to be a short fiction writer. And this book is a novel in short fiction. But I was like, no, novel. I'm not doing a novel. And this book is like, no, I want this to be a novel. I'm like, no, I cannot do this. So that was kind of the constant sort of tug. And the reason it took 17 years is because I was learning how to be a storyteller, how to be a novelist. And like I said, how to just follow these characters and let them exist on the page and do their own thing, and not impose my fears, my anxiety, et cetera, on that process. So that's sort of another long answer to your question.
Great. Let's just say that the characters transformed within you and you wrote this Borderless. That's amazing. So, thank you so much, Namrata, for the very insightful conversation and for your time this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, Haimanti. Wonderful questions. I appreciate them.
Thank you. Tell Me a Story calls for submission on the story prompt Devi. Registrations are also open for the writing program season 7. We hope to hear from you. Till then, stay well, stay happy, stay together. Good night.